Levitz is a writer for New York Magazine, The Intelligencer. Should check out all of his stuff there. Jean Bajalan is a history professor at Missouri State and writer for Jacobin. And I'm now joined by Matt Christman, who is, of course, part of the Chapo Trap House podcast, and also has been doing most days this Kush vlog.
Yeah, like 3 or 4 times a week, probably, I'd say.
Yeah, so I have to say, there was a day, not very many days ago, that like I'd woken up, I was in a pretty bad state of mind. I'd like had 2 or 3 nights in a row where I didn't get much sleep, and I had a night where like, you know, I got more sleep but had bad dreams, and I woke up and I watched one of these Kush vlogs, and there was a point in there that I think was exactly what I needed in my state of mind at that time, where you were talking first about like there was all this like really heavy stuff about how life is coping, and then the transition was immediately from there to talking about McDonald's McNuggets and how amazing it would be if all the classic Christian iconography were redone to substitute Grimace for like the cross in the sky that Constantine sees, you know, and this sign you will conquer. And anyway, thank you. I needed that. That was good.
I'm glad that you could be guided by the Holy Grimace.
Yes, absolutely. So I do want to get into some more, you know, some bigger picture stuff politically with you. But first, since I saw this last night, I can't not ask you about this. So I saw this headline. Granted, it was from the Daily Mail in the UK, so I guess that means there's like a 50% chance that it's true. But it was like the most 2020 headline ever, and I just want to read it out. QAnon supporter, 30, is charged with DWI and assault for chasing 2 motorists she thought were pedophiles.
Yeah, no, I think I've seen that confirmed elsewhere. And if not, it's certainly of a piece with other events. We've seen a big surge in Q-related vigilantism recently.
Yeah. And in fact, like I believe, right, I heard you talk about this on Chapo. There was a recent press conference or something where Trump was asked about some of this stuff.
Yes. That was on Wednesday. It was amazing. I was floating after I heard this because so a reporter asked Trump about QAnon, and it's astounding to me that these people don't know who they're dealing with after 4 years. She was clearly trying to get him to denounce them or distance himself because, like all media people, she's terrified because, well, I don't think that QAnon is a meaningful social force in the sense that it's not going to lead to, like, you know, brown shirts or anything, because the people doing it are – the QAnon – is a way to process their alienation. So it doesn't and accommodate it. It's not a way to overcome it. But if one thing that they very much could do is just start shooting people,
right?
And that very much, I think, I would predict is going to happen, especially if Biden wins. And so people with any kind of media prominence are justifiably worried about Q, and they wanted the guy that the Q people worship to denounce him. And her tack for getting him to do that was to ask him, what do you think of Q people? And his response was, well, all I know about them is that they like me. And of course, that's all he knows about them. And so he's not going to denounce them there. And so she tried a second tack where she says, she's trying to get through to him the insanity of what they believe. And she said, they think that you are saving the world from a bunch of pedophile cannibals.
And of course, what he heard was, oh my God, they think that I'm great, that I'm the savior.
Exactly. And he said, amazingly, it was amazing. He said, would that be so bad? Because yes, he heard he's the savior, and he already views his battle with the Democrats as an existential one, because he has identified himself and America as like co-substantial. And so they are by definition anti-American. They want to destroy all the good things. He has convinced himself of those things because he has to, and that is reflected in the Q people. They believe the same thing. Adding the sort of the filigree and the melodrama of cannibal pedophilia, that will only give him like a richer, imaginative, textured world to weave out of this, and a greater justification for his actions in trying to stop them from taking power. And that it indicates to me more than anything that Q is going to eventually just take over the Republican Party.
Well, there's already at least one Q believer who like won a primary in a safe red district.
Yes, in Georgia. And I think that there are probably a few other stealth Q people running. And more importantly, I think you will see establishment non-Q Republicans starting to do what they've always done, which is accommodate the fervency of the base by using their buzzwords. Yes, pedophile cannibals. If George H.W. Bush were running for office now, he would be like, we're going to get to the bottom of the deep state pedophiles eventually. Maybe not yet, but it is inevitable. It's a progression that cannot be stopped because the cognitive dissonance between the country these people think they live in and the country that they find themselves in is so vast, and they are so fully atomized and absorbed by like the spectacle of America as an emotional architecture for their lives, that as conditions worsen, the need to create a greater and greater fantasy, a more intense fantasy realm to explain the difference, to bridge the gap, is only going to metastasize.
Yeah, and I guess this is interesting too because, well, for one thing, I mean, like it gives like every step of this process is depressing because the more you get that, right, like Republicans who might find ways of splitting the difference to make themselves amenable to whatever crazy shit the base is saying now, even if it's about pedophile cannibals, right? I'm sure you can imagine lots of stuff like, look, I'm personally not convinced that we have enough evidence that all the Democrats, all of my friends in the Democratic Party are pedophile cannibals, but there are serious questions, about pedophilia and cannibalism, and we do need to investigate this. The more that happens, of course, this also gives Democratic centrists perfect cover because the bar is just lowered that much more, right? That like the same way that it's been like decades that Democrats can say, I believe in global warming, and that's kind of good enough, right? That like, oh, look, here's a guy who thinks that
they believe in science.
That's right, exactly, right? These other people don't believe in science, and we believe in science, and as long as that's the electoral distinction, then the question of what exactly are you going to do about it, less so now that there's talk about a Green New Deal and stuff, but the question of what are you going to do about it is like really secondary when you get points just for believing it. And now you can get points just for not believing the pedophile cannibalism.
Yeah. You become an august statesman by saying, I don't think that Chrissy Teigen flosses her teeth with infant bones.
Yeah. And yeah. So like, there could be lots of lots of like, you can be a reasonable person somewhat to the left of the Democrats now by saying, look, I don't, there are lots of things that I agree with Biden, disagree with Joe Biden about, or there are lots of things that I disagree with Sasha Obama or whoever in the future about, right? But really the other side believes that all Democrats should be arrested and put to death for being pedophile cannibals. Yeah. And, as long as we can stop that, right? That's really what matters.
Right. We have to banish this insanity. Of course, the constant accommodation of right wing of accelerating capitalism only increases the intensity of these feelings, which then increases the ability of Democrats to not have to stand on anything other than negating them.
Right.
Which is why, by the way, that's the trick at the heart of the entire claim to like we have to vote Democrat now to get back to like a baseline that we can then move from. Is that
the baseline keeps shifting.
Democrats in power govern from the right and worsen conditions, meaning that you will never the thing that Biden himself has said about how the fever is going to break. Well, not if you keep sticking your finger in the bullet hole like James Garfield's doctor. The cycle will only exacerbate all of these things in one ratchet-like direction. And the Democratic Party as a vehicle, as it currently exists, will only make those things worse.
Yeah, like certainly I mean, I think there are different ways of making the case that like the outcome of the election matters, right? You know, like they're more optimistic and more cynical ways. You know, I think you can think that that like at least there are certain kinds of aggressive things to do, things like destroy what's left of public sector unions that Republicans are more likely to do than Democrats. But the idea that there's going to be this great reversal of everything that was done under Trump, you know, that
right.
like what this is it's like we're going to like, you know, turn over the hourglass, you know, and it's just going to start dripping from where it was in 2015 instead of where it is in 2020 is really weird, because I can remember a time when, you know, in my 20s when George W. Bush was president, and all the things that he was doing in terms of, you know, the Patriot Act, you know, drone assassinations, you know, all of this stuff, right, was seen as this unprecedented radical illegality that, of course, you have to get the sensible party back in office so that they'll reverse all this stuff. And look, you know, they'll be bad. Of course, we all remember the Clinton years and all the bad economic stuff that happened, right? But we'll at least start from the baseline of 2000. And that isn't what happened at all.
Yeah. And now instead, you're supposed to look back on the Bush years as models of statesmanship. And
yeah, literally in 2015, Bush was so toxic that his brother wouldn't let him campaign for him. And now, like, well,
they
that
had
was
his
like
Secretary of State. They had a Secretary of State who was the point man for selling the war that killed 1 million people at the Democratic Convention. And you might remember this too, if you were on the blogs in your 20s instead of going out like I was, that at the time, Democrats were saying, I miss Reagan.
Yes.
Reagan might have done bad things and whatnot, but he was still, he had things that George W. Bush only wishes he could have. And now we are literally in a case where that guy who was beyond the pale is now comfortably inside. I mean, and you look backward, the trajectory can only go one way.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty telling that if you watched you know, the DNC, I think you're doing live commentary on that, right? So you probably sat
unfortunately
through.
I did indeed have to watch that. Boy.
Yeah, so you probably sat through quite a bit of the DNC, and one thing that was like really striking, look, I know all political conventions are vacuous, right? Like that's, you know,
right.
Like very rarely that, you know, that you're going to deviate from that, right? I mean, I guess like every now and again you get, you know, the Williams, Jennings Bryan talking about the cross of gold or whatever, you know, but like that's pretty rare, right? You know, it's especially modern conventions.
Yes.
And there are some exacerbating things that were going on with this particular convention that, you know, because it was just being held under bizarre circumstances that, you know, I mean, it was the political equivalent of watching a baseball game where they have cardboard fans in the stands, and like
that wall of clapping people at the end of the speeches, just insanely dystopian. The Logan's Run universe there. Just they should have all been wearing like weird future togas or something.
Yeah, exactly, right. And of course, like especially like even like the roll call vote, which is normally like sort of charming in a goofy way, and you know, parts of it were this time, but like some of those images from there were I mean,
it was like a parade of ISIS beheading videos. A bunch of people in masks grimly standing in a line.
Yeah. But even kind of grading on a curve for that, right? Okay, so some of this was just like media incompetence, like literally to the point where there was all this like dead air, or like you could hear people talking in the background, you know, like somehow the Democratic Party can't get it together to like get some people who know how to use Zoom and have some media skills. I don't really understand what's going on there. And some of it's just the fact that you're doing it under a plague where like nobody's really figured out how to do this yet, so it hasn't happened yet. But there's also this much more general cringiness there that I think says something less about the circumstances right now and more about the Democratic Party, joined now by Megan Day, who is one of my favorite Jacobin writers, and who I wanted to loop into this specifically on this question, right? The sort of extreme, bizarre cringiness of the Democratic Convention and what that might say, not just about, okay, they're doing it during a plague and like they haven't figured out yet that like having a wall of Zoom clapping is incredibly creepy, but also might say something about the Democrats.
Yeah. Hey, Ben. Hey, Matt.
Hey.
I think that obviously, like Ben said, some of it actually just has to do with the awkwardness of having a Zoom convention. And it's kind of awkward anyway, but made extra so by the fact that they're trying to put on this sort of like sparkly political product in a very bizarre format. So leaving that aside, giving them the benefit of the doubt, I actually think that I've been thinking since the convention that it might be useful to try to like develop a more structural analysis of why the DNC was so cringe and why the Democratic Party's political productions and spectacles are so cringe in general. This is the word that you keep seeing coming up over and over again. And my hunch is that actually what you're seeing is that the Democratic Party has to be increasingly vacuous in order to conceal the fact that because it's a cross-class coalition, it actually has two diametrically opposed political programs inside of it. Now, for a long time, one of those programs was just concealed by the fact that the working class, the organized working class, and the progressive and socialist left were just so disempowered that there was no, sort of swept under the rug, right? But as the left starts to become more organized and more visible, the contradictions within the Democratic Party become more obvious. I mean, this is a party that essentially asks Blue Cross Blue Shield executives to exist in the same sort of party structure as people who are literally getting their medical claims denied by Blue Cross Blue Shield. So it's, you see like the Republicans are putting forward this incredibly divisive vision. The Democrats are putting forward this like vision of false harmony where they're asking, Blackstone executives to exist in the same party as people who are getting evicted and having their locks glued by Blackstone. I mean, this is like I said, there's a sort of like a genuine class conflict within the party. Now, obviously, we know how that conflict gets resolved. It gets resolved in favor of the dominant class behind closed doors, right? But as the left starts to develop more visibility and more power, and I'm not going to overstate that, but more than before, you start to see that the Democratic Party has to get more and more vacuous in order to actually not touch any third rail, not touch anything substantive that would reveal the contradictions. They're trying to downplay the contradictions, right? But their ideal situation would be to downplay the contradictions and be quiet. I mean, that's sort of literally Joe Biden's strategy, right? But they can't actually, his strategy,
be on TV enough to reassure people that he's still running for president and he hasn't died, right? Like I keep expecting that by October, he's just going to go out to wave at the window for 30 seconds a day. And like, that'll be the ritual, that he won't be on TV anymore at all.
If the Democratic Party top brass, the establishment had their way, that's literally how they would interface with politics in general, because it's a lot easier than trying to do a song and dance and produce an appealing political product while not touching that third rail or not touching anything substantive that exposes the fact that there is actually an incredible class contradiction at the heart of the Democratic Party. And of course, the Republicans, too, they also have a working class base and a ruling class leadership, but they're sort of united in kind of like death cult, death drive. They like, you guys talked about it. There's other stuff going on over there that doesn't put the they're I mean, like, they can at least give people red meat, right? That like right.
that like what the Republicans, say they'll do for working class supporters and like these kind of small proprietors who are off in their base, right, is is that they're going to, that they're going to reassert something culturally, which is a little vague, and that can be kind of thin soup. But like now if they're shifting to like they're going to like track down all the pedophile cannibals and have them killed, like at least that's exciting, right? Whereas it's hard to see what's exciting that's being offered, right? Like I saw, like in Kamala Harris's acceptance speech, like the one thing that stood out for me is there's no vaccine for racism, which I guess has the virtue of being true, but like it's kind of conspicuous that she's not telling us what we should be doing about racial injustice, right? We don't have the magical racism vaccine, but now we should do what?
Right, precisely. So there's like a typical baseline Democratic Party vacuity that when it needs to rise to the level of entertaining people or impressing upon people that it exists and it's real and it has some kind of, identity, some kind of brand identity, they kind of go over the top with it and they end up being sort of like theatrical and mawkish. They go really purple with it. They make these sort of like overwrought emotional appeals that to us, I think a lot of us feel, oh my God, Marianne Williamson, actually, she knocked it out of the park. What did she say? She said that watching the DNC was like binge watching a Marriott commercial.
Yeah.
Bless her. This is what I mean. Yeah. That's why it's like that, though. The reason it's like that is not just because the people who are in charge of it have bad taste. I think that's maybe the impulse that people have, where they're like, oh, I hate these people. They have bad politics and they also have bad taste. No, it's actually much deeper than that. It's that we have a party that, unlike the Republican Party, actually theoretically purports to stand for something-ish related to working people's interests-ish, and yet actually can't go too far in articulating that without biting the hand that feeds it. And so needs to like backpedal away from that while also putting on a spectacle, and can't really throw red meat the same way that the same way that the Republican Party can, because they don't want to seem unhinged, right? So instead of seeming unhinged, they just seem really cringeworthy. So this is my theory about why it's so hard to watch them in action.
Yeah, no, I like it. By the way, somebody in the Q&A asks, do you think the left should continue to put its energy into taking over the Democratic Party or shift to building a third party? Either of you guys can get in on that, but I mean, my 2 cents would be that in a way it's a false dilemma, and also in a way the whole premise is just kind of wrong, right? So the reason I think it's a false dilemma is that if we ever got an electorally viable third party in the United States, it wouldn't happen because the left, in the form that it exists right now, like decides to will it into existence. I don't think I just don't think anything would come of that, right? Like I think it would happen the way that like the Republicans emerged out of the Whig, like the ashes of the Whigs in the 19th century, through some sort of much more organic process within like the contradictions of an existing party. But also, like, there's something really weird, I think, about the premise of the question, because it assumes that, like, in some deep sense, that, like, the left, in other words, like, people who consider themselves to be, like, conscious socialists or whatever in 2020 kind of has the power to decide what this, like, large-scale political outcome is. And that reminds me of something that I've heard you, Matt, talk about before, which is that sometimes looking at the way that online political discussions happen right now, and then the way that people try to like kind of translate that into some sort of activist or electoral efforts in the real world, it feels a little bit like, the metaphor I've heard you use is that like we're talking to each other online and we're building these like ships and like these really elaborate ships and bottles.
Yeah.
With this political program that we kind of agree on among ourselves. And then we keep trying to like go to the shipyard and be like, all right, well, we've got our ship, right? Let's see it. And now we can just take it to the ocean and we can ride it, where we want to go. But then that never really works.
Yeah, because people are creating litmus tests, basically. I mean, like what people think of as building a left is what they're actually doing is building a social group. They're orientating a social group around certain shibboleths, and then they police those. And in the course of doing that, they are able to create what is to them like a legible distinction that creates like a group of people that they can feel like, okay, these are my people. But because it's entirely synthetic and virtual, it means that taking that structure that you've created, that this ideological series of concepts, and of course, and demands on people, to be on the right side of them to count as what you consider the left, means that if you ever were to transcend the virtual bound and try to actually do something with people in a world where you're trying to affect an outcome of, say, an election or a campaign of any kind, you will find that those structures don't relate to anything. They don't relate to anything real. They relate to this battle within this self-selected, that's the most important element of it, group of people online who are essentially looking for social groupings to become part of. And that's the kind of stuff that in a practical campaign is the first to go, because there's an actual goal that people are orienting towards, that it's not just a broad concept of like building an idea of a left. It's, hey, let's get this person across the finish line, or let's stop this bill from being passed, or let's defend these people who are going to get evicted. And those questions are made subsidiary to the goal. But because the online left or left like discussion is so untethered, though that consideration doesn't enter into it, and then people end up hardening these distinctions as being the meaningful thing to assert. And that means that when you do have any opportunity to bring people in together, these notions that they have created, these artificial structures, then just smash into each other.
Yeah. It's like if you spent all this time talking to each other and you agree that like, okay, these are the boundaries of our movement, and you end up spending a lot of time, which is, if you certainly if you spend time on left Twitter, which I wouldn't recommend, like that, like what you'll see a lot of is a lot of in-group policing of those boundaries, right? It's like, okay, we all agree that you need to, have the following series of takes, to be inside the tent. And if you have a take that sounds like it doesn't quite fit with that, right, we'll sort of police that. And within that, within those boundaries, like that works to a great extent, right? People want to be on the inside, or, maybe you'll splinter the in groups and, you'll find one where everybody will accept it at least.
And the main problem is that, as you've said, people will want to be on the inside. Well, that's if they have invested some part of themselves into that as a goal, which does not apply to the vast majority of people, which means that this goes beyond what like you bring into things, but this goes into the question of communication and persuading among real people, is that normal people, regular, non-politically oriented, ideologically motivated people, have not made the same buy-in that you are assuming in all the people that you've been interacting with. You are talking almost exclusively to people who have some investment in being in something called the left, which is not a normal thing that normal people want to do. And that means that the entire apparatus that you have created to persuade, which really just boils down to coercion through the use of shibboleths as cudgels, has no effect, because the person you're trying to talk to doesn't care if you think they're a good leftist.
Yeah, because
I was going to say, I think that's a really good point. And I think that an analog is maybe for people who aren't religious, I'm not religious, is try to imagine what it would feel like if someone told you that you were not being a good like church goer or a good Christian. It just like wouldn't really, it's like, okay, it doesn't alter your behavior in any way whatsoever. So I think that's a really good analogy. Actually, I was not prepared whatsoever to talk about this, but now that Matt's talking about this, I just have to say I'm reading this book by Aaron Leonard called A Threat of the First Magnitude. And it's about the FBI's infiltration of some Maoist groups in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And one of the things they did, I mean, everybody knows this, right? Everybody knows that when the FBI infiltrates left groups, they try to heighten, they try to heighten the conflict within the group. But a sort of actual anecdote to this effect is that the group Revolutionary Union was infiltrated by the FBI, and the informant himself recommended that the inaugural edition of their paper, which is called the Red Papers, be dedicated to tearing down another group called Progressive Labor. And then they so they did it and they published it, and it was denouncing them as revisionists. And then they looked at this is before the internet, they looked at the roster of people in Progressive Labor, and they sent them in the mail issues of this in order to get under their skin. Well, now they don't have to do that. They don't have to look at rosters, and they don't have to send people issues in the mail. I mean, we literally have Twitter just accomplishes that automatically, right? So every time you get involved in a doctrinal fight on left Twitter, imagine yourself as essentially doing precisely what the FBI informant was doing when shipping out copies of
you don't need to ship out the red paper when we all live in this like online panopticon where everybody's surveilling everybody as a matter of course anyway.
And what's really amazing about it is that, like, as with the FBI infiltrators, I mean, now all movements are totally open to police informants, but also just bad faith self-promoters and narcissists and maniacs. Because if shibboleths are the only thing you can go by, if you're assuming bad faith in everyone because you're trying to sort more than anything, then all anyone has to do is master the language. And they are in. And that means that whatever obstructive or undermining or counterproductive actions are then filtered through a lens of, well, they're on my side, so there must be something to what they're saying because they're saying the right things.
Mm-hmm. That's what this is also the FBI intentionally, they created something called the Ad Hoc Committee for a Marxist-Leninist Party or something like that. I mean, it's a little alarming to imagine them aping the language so perfectly. And apparently they were putting out papers and it was all like, and not a lot of it was pretty well concealed. I mean, a lot of it was not necessarily divisive in nature. I mean, they were trying to be in it for the long haul, right? So they were in some ways looking like they were participating in good faith. Yeah. And the other, I guess, anecdote while we're on this is that the FBI wouldn't merely send people into these groups. It would also pluck people who had been made pariahs in these groups. It was very conscious of looking for people who had been have involved but had been socially excluded or had some sort of like personal grievance or bitterness because of the way they'd been treated by the group, and to find people who'd been abandoned by something that they'd given their life to, right? And those were the perfect targets to turn into informants. I guess one of the lessons you draw from that is that if you're participating in that process of turning people into pariahs, I'm not just talking about the likelihood of police infiltration. I'm just talking about, look, what the FBI or the CIA or whatever, what they're doing is simply trying to accelerate processes that dissolve left groups automatically. Do you know what I mean? So like we're not just talking about leaving yourself open to police infiltration. We're talking about the police are very good at figuring out what we do to ourselves that destroys our own movement and just like pressing those buttons. So there are lessons, in fact, to learn from their strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to switch gears though, because we've been talking about this sort of weird behavior of the online left and the way that this in-group enforcement can work for us. But I am also curious, now that Kamala Harris is the vice presidential nominee, about this sort of weird online behavior of the people who are the most enthusiastic about Kamala Harris, like weirdly enthusiastic for somebody who is a pretty uninteresting kind of centrist politician, like if anything, kind of like a weather vane of where the Democratic Party is, like at any given time. Up until very recently, her big selling point was that she was such a tough cop, and but now she's all on top of various criminal justice reform things. There was a long weekend where she supported Medicare for all to position herself for a presidential run, and then she was back to supporting some kind of two-tiered, public option, system. So you wouldn't think that this is the sort of figure who would inspire this kind of like rabid, you are our queen and we will die for you level devotion.
Well, I think I mean her lack of qualities, certainly positive ones, but seems like almost any, is it highlights the phenomenon and shows the sort of oddness of the intensity of feeling, but the general dynamic, I think, is predicated on the fact that you have among Democratic voters, at least a significant portion of them, they have at a certain level, either because it's in their interests or because they have lost faith that things can change, sublimated or obliterated their demand that the party do anything to make anybody's life better, and have replaced that with a passionate desire to see some sort of ratification of their identity in their political leaders. And that was a big theme in the Democratic primary, but then the joke of it all culminated. The punchline is that the person who the party regulars, the people who most reliably vote, chose was a guy who defied all of those categories, the whitest, malest, straightest guy you could imagine, old soda pop Joe Biden, which meant which creates cognitive dissonance. And since the Republicans, or not being political, are not an option for people like this for various psychological and social reasons, the presence of someone on the ticket who embodies these identity categories that they value becomes the entire and sole vector for their emotional connection to the ticket and the party. And so has to have this huge psychic place in their imaginations, even though they're fully not up to the task. I mean, a similar thing happens with conservatives. I mean, the people who fixate on Trump as a masculine figure of like untrammeled American, manhood and virility, this waddling doughball who can't drive a car. It's a similar
not like Joe Biden's
fantasy.
Father. He could drive a car.
He could drive a car. It's a similar psychic, like, fantasy projection to compensate for the fact that the fantasy is necessary. And I think that's a lot of the appeal of Harris.
I agree with what Matt said. I also think that there's something else going on. This is basically it hits on the exact same thing that I mentioned earlier, talking about like why the Democratic Party's cultural productions are so embarrassing and painful to watch. I mean, ultimately, if the structural explanation for that has to do with the fact that the Democratic Party is a very awkward and incoherent cross-class coalition, I think that also is at least partly the explanation for, and this dovetails with what Matt was saying, but partly the explanation for the presence of militant centrists. And militant centrists in the party's base are a real phenomenon. I think they're growing phenomenon, actually. I think that probably the first flash of them that you really saw, look, I'm sure you can find examples of this throughout history, but like at the very least, we should be drawing a through line between the Pumas and the K-Hive. So if you right, like the Pumas were the people who were pro Hillary Clinton in 2008, who were very upset that Barack Obama had won the primary and didn't want to vote for him. And their little acronym, their slogan for themselves was "Party Unity, My Ass," right? And that became the acronym PUMA, and they became the Pumas. These were the militant centrists. They were, more politically conservative, but also extremely enamored of identity politics. And they're actually the sort of first people to go out there and like craft what eventually became like the vanguard of what that actually looks like, which we're starting to see really flourish in the Democratic Party today. And so a lot of these K-Hive people, they're not new to politics, actually. Some of them are, but they weren't necessarily drawn in by Kamala Harris. They're actually just epiphenomenal to the contradictions in the Democratic Party, and they've been around for a while, and their new manifestation is as K-Hive, right? So it makes perfect sense for them. And my feeling is that we're going to be stuck with them until the contradictions are resolved, essentially. So we should all just buckle in, because people like this are going to be around for a while. Yeah,
absolutely.
And another thing, just while we're on the topic, is that having spent some time, I logged off Twitter for a year and a half, and then I got back on in like August of last year, and did the whole primary, and now I'm off again. I feel good about it, taking a break. But during that time, during the primary, when I was on, I was really seeing the way that the Bernie Bro online harassment narrative was being mobilized against the Bernie campaign, and also starting to see the rise of this new iteration of the Pumas, the K-Hive. And I was starting to see them actually as a much more literal embodiment of precisely the type of things that the media was saying about the Bernie Bro army. They are actually, Micah Utrecht, my co-writer and editor at Jacobin, was comparing them to the Wide Awakes, calling them digital paramilitaries. These people are incredibly militant. And there was
just to make sure anybody's listening to this not familiar, that was the like quasi paramilitary organization that would do like torchlight parades, of basically young Lincoln supporters when he ran for president.
Mm. And so that's essentially what we've got now, but these are Kamala Harris's wide awakes. Well, the other point that I was going to make, is the media giving them an enormous pass in the way that you didn't see with the sort of Bernie bros. I mean, look, there are a lot, when people who are as passionate about something with stakes as high as politics have internet access by the millions, you're going to find all kinds of behavior, right? You can cherry pick and do whatever you want. But when it came to Bernie Sanders and his supporters, they essentially tried to transform what I think was his greatest strength, the passion of his supporters, into his greatest weakness, sort of hit them where they're strongest, not where they're weakest, was the thinking there. And now when it comes to Kamala Harris and the K-Hive, you see the exact same reporters. I mean, literally the same reporters publishing articles, right? That's Scott Bixby of the Daily Beast. You know what I'm talking about? People should really go try to find 2 articles written by Scott Bixby a few months apart, The Toxic Bernie Bros and Kamala Harris has built a digital army with which she is going to defeat Donald Trump. Yay, great, thanks.
I guess just like one last thing about this, because there's something like there is something like that really does seem like deeply strange about this to me. Because granted, right, as you say, lots of stuff is at stake in electoral politics. Even in cases like sort of which centrist is represented in the Democratic Party, where maybe less is at stake, people invest it with a lot. You have millions and millions of people who have social media. You are going to get a certain amount of this, but like it does vary, right? Like there was no dedicated army of people who was quite as intense about like Mayor Pete or like most of these people as there were about Kamala Harris. And so like it's something like, I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe some of this is just like they happen to coalesce. Some of this is obviously about identity. Maybe some of this is just like at the right moment they started to coalesce around her, and then at that point, who she is maybe just doesn't matter that much because this is what she symbolizes for them, and so as long as she's like basically going to act within the parameters of how any politician would act, they can like just stay dedicated to her forever as she does this like weird tepid maneuvering about like about how to present repackaged centrism.
I think that it's the combination of contempt for the left and the kind of like psychological profile of people who have extreme contempt for the left, which Matt was getting into, coupled with the ability that Kamala as a Black woman gives them to also hold at the same time the righteous indignation and the sort of like identity politics affect. And the combination of those two things actually produces like an exponential level of intensity, I think. And that's probably why you see it explode with the K-Hive. It's also just the case that for whatever reason, and I don't entirely know why, Kamala got those people instead of Pete. I think it could have been Pete, it could have been Liz, right? But once it became Kamala, there is a bit of groupthink, and there is a bit of like, I don't mean groupthink to be derogatory. I mean, there's just like, there's patterned behavior. People want to be on the inside. People want to have like a sense of group identity. And so they go where the others are going. And eventually it was Kamala, and that started happening. I think sure it caught her by surprise in the same way that the phenomenon of the Bernie bro, I'm sure caught Bernie Sanders enormously by surprise. And I'm sure it took him a very long time to even begin to understand what the hell was happening. When his aides were coming and explaining to him what was going on, people were so excited about him on the internet, right? I don't think that she consciously cultivated it at all. I think it was just a process.
Oh no! If she tried to, it would have failed miserably.
Right.
I mean, if she had tried to get people to see her that way, that would have made people aware of the phenomenon. Like it has to be like this almost subconscious transference, and so you just have to be the vessel, and that's what she was.
Makes sense. All right, thank you guys both so much. I really hope that you both come back on soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ben.
So that was Megan Day from Jacobin. and Matt Christman from Chapo Trap House. So if you're not reading Migan and Jacobin, you really should be. Also, her and Mike Utrick's book Bigger Than Bernie, which is a really smart look at democratic socialist strategy. And I think there's like statistically a pretty good chance that if you're watching or listening to this, you listen to Chapo Trap House. But if you're not watching Matt's Kush vlogs, I really recommend them. But right now we are inaugurating. We kind of got this when David was a guest last week. So David Griscom from the Michael Brooks Show of the Griscom Economic Minutes said earlier that he's my second favorite Texan after the one I'm married to, and he's agreed to come back and make the kind of stuff we were talking about last time a regular weekly segment. I think we could call it Outlaws and Revolutionaries.
I love it.
So I saw you take a sip of something earlier. What was that?
Dude, I'm having some Buffalo Trace, which is my go-to bourbon these days.
Nice. Yeah, no, I have just been, drinking this Oberon, but I did pour a glass of bourbon to start when you came on to do the segment.
Hell yeah.
So this is Woodford Reserve. So it's a pretty nice smooth bourbon. But on a not entirely unrelated topic, I want to talk about country music. You defended the leftist credentials of Willie Nelson last time. Thought we'd maybe go through a couple more of these guys, the first couple of these segments, and then just kind of settle into you can just talk about some of your favorite music, and when politics comes up, it comes up. But the obvious place to go now for this week would be to talk about Johnny Cash.
Yeah, and I'm really happy to talk about Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash is somebody whose legacy I don't feel like you have to defend as much because he is such a rebel figure for so many people. But I just wanted to give a little vocabulary to that argument to folks. I don't know, Johnny Cash is remembered more for sort of being, drinking a lot, causing a lot of trouble, and just sort of having a kind of FU persona. But people forget about how radical a lot of his music is. Obviously, there's Man in Black, which is a phenomenal song if you're not familiar with it. It's basically where he explains why he wears the black. And he, tells this story where he says, I like to wear a rainbow every day and tell everybody that the world is not okay. And then he starts, everything in the world is okay. And then he starts going through the problems in the world, primarily that a lot of people are really suffering and are unable to, provide for themselves. He wears the black for the poor and beaten down. Really a radical anthem in a lot of ways. Basically he's seeing and presenting himself as a kind of champion for the people who are left behind, which I think is fundamental to Johnny Cash's music and persona and his legacy, in my opinion. But a couple songs that people might not know as much, because what kind of annoying lefties get on about Johnny Cash is that, he had a little bit of a patriotic streak. Obviously, the song Ragged Old Flag, which, I think played in the Super Bowl or something like that, definitely plays on those things. But I think it's a great song and a good sentiment. But another thing that he gets a lot of flack for is for playing for Richard Nixon in the White House during the Vietnam War. And I understand why people are worked up about that, but I think a lot of people forget the song that he sang to Richard Nixon, which is a song called What is Truth? And it's basically a song that he wrote. I can't remember the university that he was playing at, but basically he was playing at a university and he spent, the afternoon talking with people, and he started writing down sort of their thoughts and their questions. And, I won't sing the whole song or even go through all the lyrics, but basically the song it's an anti-war song. It's an anti-Vietnam song. It's saying, why are we fighting the war? And the lonely voice of youth asks, what is truth? And honestly, if you do believe in the power of music and art, which I do, if you could imagine any better song to sing to somebody like Richard Nixon, I think that's really it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think even in terms of the patriotic streak, I mean, I think if your perspective is that all sort of national identity is bad because we should be internationalists, and I agree with some of the premise, of course. I think international working class solidarity is important, but I think you're also going to miss a lot of the shades, right?
Yeah.
That there are, that not all national identity has the same political character, right? So like certainly, for example, right, when I think about Johnny Cash and the patriotic element of his music, like one of the first songs that comes to my mind is the Ballad of Ira Hayes.
Yeah, that's a great jam. No, I think that's 100% right. And I mean, even zooming out a little bit, I know patriotism, I mean, it's such a toxic word, and most of that is just pure ideology. But that being said, like everyone knows, I mean, not everybody knows me, but for people who know me, know that I'm a socialist and a radical, all of these things. But I like this place a lot, and I like the people here, and I like the culture. And, I have very fond feelings about this country too. And I think that that's something that we shouldn't just cede. I think it's a very universal thing. And it's actually something that we should cultivate. Not necessarily like kind of like a right patriotism or something like that.
Yeah.
But a kind of like a love for the people in general, the people around you, and a love for your community is a beautiful thing. And we shouldn't shy away from it just because so much of like patriotism, and I wouldn't even call my feelings to be patriotic per se, because that is such obviously like a right-wing militaristic idea. We shouldn't shy away from being able to say like, oh, I love this country and I love the people in it. I love the stories and the history and all that. But there's one more song that I would like to read a couple lyrics from.
Yeah. Just quick before you do that, though, right? Like I did want to jump in, just kind of.
Let's go for it. No, go for it first then.
Yeah, underline and circle that point, right? Like that there is something that is that I don't know. Like this always bugs me, right? I've talked about this on here before. Like when like you get like a sort of certain like kind of lefty who will like every 4th of July they'll post stuff on social media about how like the American Revolution was actually bad and you shouldn't celebrate this and whatever. And like I always think like, okay. This is something that's obviously you're talking about very complicated history, and there's lots of real stuff that you could bring up to support that narrative. But like also there's lots of stuff that wouldn't, right? And in terms of thinking about how that sort of past, democratic revolution with all of its internal contradictions, right, could relate to what we want now. This just kind of always struck me as the most tone deaf response, right? First, because like, come on, like just, it wouldn't kill you to just like, have a hot dog, have a couple of drinks, like enjoy the people that you love, right? That like, don't be a complete weirdo about this, but like also that like you can look at different aspects of that history and draw different things from it, the same way that in the Ballad of Ira Hayes, right? Cash, is talking about this patriotic imagery, right? Raising the flag in Iwo Jima, but like he's talking about it in the context of talking about this Native American soldier who's been treated very badly, by the country that he lives in. And so there's a lot there for us politically. And I've always liked, one of those Mensheviks who I probably have many more fond feelings about than you do. Michael Harrington, has this line in his book Fragments of the Century.
Great line. I love this line.
Yeah, where he says, it was as a socialist and because I was a socialist that I fell in love with America. And saying that, I'm not indulging in romantic nostalgia about youthful days on the road, but rather underlining a crucial political truth. If the left wants to change this country because it hates it, then the people will never listen to the left and the people will be right. To be a socialist, to be a Marxist, is to take an act of faith, of love even, toward this land. It is to sense the seed beneath the snow, to see beneath the veneer of corruption and meanness and commercialization of human relationships, men and women capable of controlling their own destinies. To be a radical is to be in the best and only decent sense of the word, to be patriotic. And, and I'm sure there's stuff there that could be nitpicked, but I think the basic sentiment is really good and really well put. And that, like, I think if we're just going to sort of like react to any kind of musical invocation of American identity, like a vampire reacting to the cross, like that's just not a very good political instinct.
I 100% agree. I'd also add that, formal freedoms matter and formal principles matter. And even though we know, for example, the line "all men are created equal" has never been realized or even come close to being realized, and was a very almost like cynical line to put in, at a time obviously when people were in human bondage. The fact that people grow up in a political community where that is taught as like this is the founding idea of the country, something that social, like to me, like that premise is a socialist premise, and it's something that we should actually invoke. And to say, like, actually, let's hold ourselves to these kind of standards. I think there's a huge strategic failing to walk away, actually, from a lot of the rhetoric, which, yes, it's not been met. But that doesn't mean that people don't have, like, a feeling and a beauty and a motivation to try to enact that on a certain level.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I mean, I think that, like, you can acknowledge the contradiction between the ideals, the best of the ideals of the American Revolution, of the democratic tradition, and the reality of America both then and now. But like acknowledging that contradiction doesn't mean that you should throw out the first part, right? It means that you should, like, the much better strategy is to hold on to the first part and use it, in order to expose the failures of the second part. But before I cut you off, you're going to talk about another Cash song.
Yeah, no, I'll do it real quick. But just before, we have a great history in this country too. Johnny Cash recognized that. A fun thing about Johnny Cash, a lot of people didn't know, that he actually played John Brown in the television, like the long-form television show North and South, which is just another great Johnny Cash.
That is an amazing detail.
And he looks great as a John Brown too. But I wanted to just point out a great working class song by Johnny Cash called "Oni," and I'll just read the opening line from it. Where he says, "I dedicate this song to the working man, for every man that puts in 8 or 10 hard hours a day of work and toil and sweat. Always got somebody looking down his neck, trying to get more out of him than he really ought to have to put in," right? Which is, in my opinion, is just like a great example of, kind of capitalist exploitation as a concept. But anyways, this song is a really fun song because the story is basically a guy who spent his whole life working at a factory, and it's his last day. And he knows that he's going to get, clapped for and get a gold watch or whatever when he walks out. But what he's really excited for is when the whistle blows, he's going to punch his supervisor in the mouth. It's a great jam. I'll post it on Twitter after this. It's a really fun one.
That is amazing. And I love that he played John Brown. I was actually just reading this article in Unheard by our friend and comrade Ralph Leonard, which starts out with this great detail, right? Which is, I'm just going to read out here. Shortly after his divorce from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X was asked in an interview whether he would accept whites into his short-lived upstart organization, the Organization for Afro-American Unity, OAAU. Definitely not, he instantly snipped. But after a moment's contemplation, he added, "If John Brown were still alive, we might accept him."
I mean, fair enough.
All right. Thank you so much, David. I know that you're smoking some meat right now.
I'm interested. My poor man's brisket is going great. I'm about to pull it off in about 20 minutes.
Nice. All right. See you next week, David.
I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye. All right. So next week we are going to be slowing down a little bit and just having two guests, so we can have slightly longer conversations. The guest you just listened to, of course, was David Griscom from the Michael Brooks Show. And before that, we had Matt Christman from Chapo Trap House, Megan Day from Jacobin, Jean Bajelon, who writes for Jacobin and is also a history professor at Missouri State, and Eric Levitz from New York Magazine. But next week, the two guests are going to be Nathan Robinson, who's the editor of Current Affairs, and then Yaron Brook from the Ayn Rand Institute. So obviously, Yaron is coming on to argue with me. So Nathan Nathan Robinson and I just co-wrote an article that was a review of Glenn Beck's book, Arguing with Socialists. I read that because I had gotten up to 100 patrons on my Patreon. And so I told people that if I made it up to 100, the equivalent that I was going to do of a food bucket challenge or something like that, would be that I would read Glenn Beck's Arguing with Socialists. And I did indeed, that big bowl of spiders, I ate every single spider. I read the whole thing. And it wasn't very good. I think it's effective propaganda in some ways, maybe more effective than we might like to admit. But certainly the reasoning is terrible. And so Nathan and I talk about it in the review, which the issue just came out, so it should be mailed to print subscribers very shortly. And I think there's going to be an online version of the review posted eventually. So next week, Nathan and I are going to start out talking about Glenn Beck. I read the book, so I could write my half of the review. We're going to have to talk, by the way, about what literary food bucket I could eat when I get up to for 500 patrons, which would be the next goal. That's patreon.com/Ben Burgis. You get early access to these episodes after the Zoom recordings. Also get weekly essays and regularly scheduled Discord office hours voice chats. But we're going to start out talking about the Beck review and about Glenn Beck in general. Nathan actually also read a biography of Beck, while we were writing the review. And I think if you look at Beck's whole history, it tells us a lot about the right. And then we're going to use that as the jumping off point for talking about several more of these right-wing ghouls that Nathan has written about, people like race science huckster Charles Murray, co-author of The Bell Curve, like Ayn Rand, and a few others. And then during the second half of the show next week, I'm going to be arguing with Yaron Brook from the Ayn Rand Institute about the Randian view of selfishness and why they think it's a virtue, and what sort of argument they can make for this, and why I'm radically unpersuaded by all of that. So that is coming up next week. Somebody in the chat asked if we're going to have a chalkboard for talking about Beck. We totally should have. Going to think about whether there's a good way to incorporate that. But meanwhile, this should be going up in nice edited forms. Patrons get immediate access to the Zoom recording, but it should be going out into the world as a podcast on Monday. You can download that, and please also rate and review at all of the usual podcast places, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all of those. And it will premiere on YouTube, the video version, at 7:30 p.m. on Monday. We do that at 7:30, so it doesn't conflict with the Jacobin talks that are supposed to end at 7, but often go a little bit over. But meanwhile, I really enjoyed this. I hope you guys did too. I will see you next week.